There's something that, AI cannot replace, which is trust, confidence, making a person feel seen and heard so that they can step into a better version of themselves. Like there's a lot of very humanistic things that, you cannot get a computer to do for you.
Looks like we're on. Cool.
All right.
Winnie Tsang, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
I am good. I'm happy to be here. Happy to have this conversation.
I don't think, I'm convinced Toronto needs a lot more people like you because you're the chair of the board of a mental health organization. And in your day to day work life, I get the sense that you also really look out for people, even though it's work and though it might be profit oriented at the end of the day. So Toronto needs more of you, Winnie. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. I'm so happy to be having this conversation. And a little bit about me, I would say, yeah, I am a mother, a wife, a daughter. I'm very close and very family oriented, but also professionally, like I want to make a positive difference in the world. So I would say that, wherever I choose to invest time and energy, I hope it's, through a little bit of effort, it actually multiplies. So
Right.
and whether that's in not-for-profit work, whether that's work in consulting or even in financial services, sometimes I really look for that opportunity to make a small difference, but then it has this ripple effect in someone's life. And I
Right.
find that very inspiring.
I don't think it's just me, but Toronto has lost some of its kind spirit, I find. And whether that's a result of COVID or other societal factors, that I'm not sure. But what I do know is things seem to be friendlier going back a certain amount of time. So is that something that you perceive as well?
I mean, it's an interesting observation. I mean, it's interesting. There's like this, we look back and we think pre-COVID, post-COVID, the world seems so different. And I think certainly COVID put a lot of our resilience to the test for a lot of people. I think especially whether you worked in healthcare, whether you worked in the mental health field, I think we saw a lot of those like health factors exacerbate as a population. So like how that plays out in day-to-day interactions is not surprising. I think we saw, if you remember after COVID, like all these stores and companies like came out with these little buttons or t-shirts that ask you to be kind to the staff.
I still see remnants of those signs in
Yeah.
random places.
And it really was a reflection of like how much conflict people were actually bringing forward in these day-to-day interactions that we actually needed to like stand up a posture of like reset almost. How do we treat each other and how do we see the other as a human?
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I think that's the element that I miss or I perceive as missing most is that the sense that we're all human. We live in this mega city with highly trying circumstances, whether it be traffic or infrastructure, construction, other pressures from life.
Yeah.
So anything that injects that humanity into day-to-day life, I think it's vital and priceless. So my hat goes off to people like yourself that I think are conscious of it and something that I think we need a lot more of in the city.
Yeah. And it could be something, a small gesture sometimes can make all the
Right.
difference too, right?
So we met quite a long time ago. I'm going to say possibly 13 to 14 years back. And I helped you. Was it your first condo purchase?
It was my very first home, Oliver.
A question for you. Did you have the sense, because back then I had only been licensed only for maybe 3, 4 years. Did you get the sense that I was kind of green or did I already seem like a seasoned pro?
No, you're very professional, very professional. Like you did I don't think I knew that you were newer to the industry back then. I did not have that
Oh,
sense
thank
at
you.
all. But what I appreciated most about you was just how honoring you were of like the experience. As a first-time home buyer, it's kind of nerve-wracking to go through this experience to figure out our budgets, to like revise the budget, et cetera, right? Like there's all these kind of like interesting steps, but I thought you were very compassionate and professional.
When I visit, oh, thank you. When I visit that neighborhood, let's call it Deer Park, Young and St. Clair, And this happens very infrequently, but I think of I'm because I'm very happy where I live in Riverdale. But I think if I were to move, that's probably on the top of my list between and a lot top of a lot of people's lists, but between Summerhill and let's call it Deer Park, Yonge and St. Clair. How did you find life there, kind of on a day-to-day basis?
It was fantastic. Like I've moved more north now, as I mentioned to you. I'm in Markham and Unionville now. But
Mhm.
if I was still, without children, happy to live in kind of a condo lifestyle, then I would still choose that neighborhood for sure. It's very pedestrian, very friendly, very pet friendly. So you've got
Mm.
pets. It's lovely. Um, it's just like got a lot of, and you're very central to everything. And that's what
Right.
I loved about it too.
Yonge is now one lane in each direction, so I think it's a headache for drivers. I wouldn't get anywhere near Yonge during rush hour, but boy, when you're commuting by bike or subway, it's incredibly convenient. So this vision that I think we have for the city, or many of us have for the city, of being truly transit oriented, whether that be on your bike or on the subway, it's working at Yonge and St. Clair.
Mm.
So there's that dedicated bike lane. And oh, this reminds me of I think the greatest travel hack, maybe number two in the whole city. And that is, let's say you live in that neighborhood and you have to get downtown. Take your bike, it's 98% downhill, right?
Yes,
And
it's true.
you hardly have to pedal to get to, say, Yonge and King. And then when you're done your appointment or what have you, hop on the subway as long as it's not rush hour with your bike and head back up, and you've hardly broken a sweat. So that's travel hack. I'm going to call that number two, the number one travel hack in the city. And it's surprising how few people kind of pick up on this, aside from those already in the know, is living in the junction around the UP Express station at Dundas
Mm.
West. I've timed it, it's 7 minutes. So you see these Bay Streeters in their suits hopping in at Union Station. I think the ticket is $5 or $6. They hop off 7 minutes later at Dundas West UP Express Station, and they're home, I'm sure, within minutes. So that's travel hack number one.
It's
Travel hack number
true.
two is Yonge and St. Clair.
More people should take advantage of that. Absolutely. And if anything, I think the vision is like that, those stops start to expand out, right? Like to even the suburbs where I am. Like I think the last couple times I've been downtown, I also took the GO train. It's just so much more convenient and less stress and like just more predictable like commutes.
Yeah, circling back to the lack of, let's call it kindness in the city, much of it is based on getting around. And you can hop in your car feeling great. And when you get to your destination in double the time it should take, it's hard to be kind and polite. So that's kind of a big part of what we have, what we're struggling with, I think, as a city. Tell us a bit about what you do for work. You're in and correct me if I'm wrong, in wealth management, if I could use a broad term, but your approach is, I'd say, really different than the norm. So, what is sort of your overriding or overarching approach to what you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And maybe also ties into my values and like my background and why I step into the space and the difference we want to make. Right. So I mentioned to you, I'm very close with my family. And in particular, I'm very close with my grandparents. And so I'm one of those families where we immigrated to Canada. My parents worked full time to make a living, to care for us. But my grandmother lived with us and she essentially raised us. So for me, like family means this broader context of kind of like the multiple generations in one household. And so when I went back to do a master's degree in health administration, I was really curious about the space. I kind of wanted to double down on caregivers. So particularly caregivers of older adults as we kind of step into that phase of life. Like, what is it that's going to make the biggest difference in how we uplift caregivers? Because they're doing the hidden work behind the scenes, right?
Right.
And it was so fascinating. So, Oliver, I had a chance to interview probably over 60 families. And not only did I speak with the caregiver, sometimes I got to speak with the older adult, I got to speak with the spouse or the sibling. Like I was trying to get a very like broad stroke understanding of these stories.
Hmm.
Um, and the stories are very human, which is very beautiful and lovely, but also, it's not always picture perfect, right? Like there are a lot of very real struggles there.
Mhm,
But the common thread I saw through every family, regardless of whether you have lots of resources or you're very short of resources, was this idea and this tension, I would say, around financial management and how
mhm,
challenging that is when, you're caring for an older adult, but you're also responsible for navigating on behalf of their finances.
mhm.
And that might kind of, interact with other stakeholders or family members. Like, so for instance, lots of siblings take care of mom and dad, but one sibling might work in another province or work overseas and, how they navigate that. And it just opened up this world for me around like, how do we make this easier, more transparent? How do we build trust within a family? And what
Mm.
does that need to look like? And that essentially led me into really thinking about what does multi-generational, like whole family wealth planning need to look like?
Boy, a whole bunch of ideas popped into my mind while you gave that response. And one is I have a dear friend right now who is one of two siblings. The other sibling lives in the States, and their mom recently passed away. But for a period of years, the one sibling, my friend, was the, let's call it primary caregiver. And there is now, despite him being the kindest guy on the planet, there is some tension with the other sibling who lives out of country. It's without getting into the details, it's something that almost seems insurmountable because there's a geographical distance. They have a different mindset in regard to the timing of certain vital steps and this added layer of the sister living in the US. So this has probably been repeated millions of times, this same story, but it really hit home because these are two people that are actually very kind. I've met the sister as well. And yet, even still, there was quite a degree of tension with, amongst other things, financial matters related to the family. And it was two things. Sad to see, of course, but there was a sense of, I had going through my mind, how how would I manage this any differently? And I don't know that I could. So I wonder if having some outside guidance, sometimes having an outside voice in these matters can be highly helpful in sort of breaking a logjam. Is that something in your work experience that you've found?
Yeah, it's such the story you shared, I mean, it resonates with me because that's the story of so many. We always, when we step into these roles, we come into it with the best of intentions, right?
Mhm,
Like, we're here to honor our mother or father, they've cared for us. It's now our turn. It's our duty that, for some of us, like in our cultural background, like that's just like part of who we are. Like that's
mhm,
expected of us, but that's like the value that we bring. For me also, it's like, the example I want to show my children as well, right? Like how we care for my grandparents or my parents. But where your question around, is it helpful to get outside help? I would say sometimes because we forget how to behave like team members when we are a family. So
mhm,
it's almost like, when you come to work and you have to work in a team, you bring a different mindset about how you
mhm,
set up that team for success. And actually, when you come into caregiving and it's siblings that now, live likely very separate lives, right? Right.
mhm,
But are now coming back together in this collaborative effort, like
mhm.
setting those right boundaries, expectations, having the communication, having like all the best practices you would bring into a work-oriented team, you almost need to bring some of those things into a family context. And that
Right.
switch is not always apparent for people.
The sibling relationship so often is sort of based on the relationship established decades ago when you're growing up. And that
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily translate ideally, let's say, to then being in a role, say in your 40s or 50s, of taking care of your parents because, well, the relationship has changed. People change over time, of course. You can't go back to necessarily how the relationship was when you were teens among siblings. And I saw this on, I guess, my feed the other day is, you're 40 something, let's say, you may well have young kids in the house and you're increasingly having to kind of help out and take care of your parents. And it's a lot coming together at once, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's not uncommon where if the health issues escalate, where an individual, one of the family members, one of the siblings might actually take a leave of absence from their work, right?
I
Or they're
see.
stepping away from things that they would otherwise have to, time away from family, which creates
Mm,
tension between spouses.
mm,
Right. So it's just the reality of the caregiving experience is so demanding that I think on a couple of fronts. So for someone who actually, isn't experiencing it or perhaps is a remote caregiver, it's almost they don't even know what that's like until they live a day in those shoes. Right. So sometimes there's just a lack of perhaps understanding or empathy. Right.
mm,
And then secondly, it's, how do we find moments of intentional rest?
mm.
Because I think that's important. I don't know if you remember, like we both have young children and I remember like, that first year where the baby's born and you're kind of like, that your whole world has changed. And I remember really being happy to go back to work because you can like put on adult
Sure.
clothes again and like interact with
Yep.
have real conversations. Like people need to feel a sense of who they are like,
Absolutely.
amongst the
Yeah.
many hats that they wear. And I find that for a lot of caregivers, that's very hard to do. So
Right.
statistically, for a lot of caregivers, their social circle shrinks, right?
Mhm.
Not only they don't have really any time or effort, right? And or, what's top of mind for them is maybe not the kind of social conversations that others want to entertain, right?
Mhm.
So that happens a lot. Then they're bearing, kind of a lot of times, even in the caregiving relationship, if let's say the older adult is experiencing dementia, there are changes sometimes to personalities, to
Mm.
moods, to their experience of reality, and that is very challenging for a caregiver to navigate.
One of the challenges that I imagine arises, and this bears out through my own work experience, is what do we do with the family home? So on the one hand, generalizing now, but it's often the case where the grandparents or grandparent naturally has a strong sense of attachment to the family home in a sense that, hey, I bought this home ages ago with the intention of spending the rest of my days here and also perhaps even passing it along to the next generation, to my children. And meanwhile, the children, well, they might be happy with that, or there might be a sense of, hey, we have this big home that it's perhaps family sized, and now just the one grandparent is there, and the huge question of do does the grandparent, and it's a question that all of us are going to face eventually, do you stay in the home or do you need assistance to the point that something outside of home is called for? Is this a circumstance that you encounter on a fairly regular basis as well?
Yeah, I mean these journeys are more and more prevalent now, right? Like, even amongst friends and colleagues of mine, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, I think there's a couple of, pivotal decisions there. One is, is it safe? Right? Like, can the individual live well independently with what
Mm.
kind of support, what resources are available to make that support possible? Sometimes it's a mix of like, government funded support and self-pay support, right? So
Mhm.
there's a variety of those things, right? And then, if there's a need to look beyond that, it's interesting. A lot of people are surprised at how much these, retirement living facilities, how much they cost. Right. So a lot of the private facilities, they start at $10,000 a month. Right. And
I've
they go
heard
up.
this, and
Yeah.
I never had a concept of the cost. I thought, hey, this is going to be something somehow government subsidized. Perhaps those options exist, but I had someone just the other day tell me about a cost in that sort of league, and I was shocked. How do you afford that?
Yeah. Which is why, for a lot of people, they might have to sell their primary residence,
Mm.
shore up the financials to do that. Other people will plan ahead. I think there are ways that you can consider planning ahead so that you can have a sum of money that then funds those needs, right? So advanced planning always the
It's where
best.
you come in.
Yeah, which is why like I think, when we observe, hey, this is how it played out for let's say my grandparents, that I'm thinking about, wow, like I wouldn't want to impose that on my children, for example, then I'm thinking ahead around what that needs to look like for us, right? So I feel like every generation is getting more sophisticated in the way that they think about it, the way that they plan for it, right? But, even government funded ones that you were just mentioning, Oliver, there's lots of wait lists. It's very needs based. So you need to be, like a very high need to qualify, right, for a space.
Mm.
But even when you do qualify for a space, there's a copay component that is roughly $2,000 a month. So it's not completely zero out of pocket, right? So
Mm.
so all of these factors make people have to think differently about how they plan for that. There's lots of scenarios also, Oliver, going back to that grandparents' home where, a lot of people don't realize when you're passing on an asset to the next generation, the taxes that are involved sometimes make it impossible for the next generation to hold on to that home,
Mm.
where they can't afford the taxes in order to hold on to the home, so they actually have to sell the home. And so, like, all of these things, like, starts with like what's important to you in
Mm.
terms of like what you want to pass down and the legacy you want to leave behind, and how do we create that and make that possible with the least amount of cost.
Is there, through intelligent planning, is there sort of an approach that helps to minimize the impact of those taxes without perhaps getting into too much technical detail?
Yeah.
Is it inevitable, or are there benefits to planning well ahead?
Absolutely, there are benefits to planning well ahead because I think you don't ever want to be in a situation where an asset is passed down and let's say you split it amongst two children, let's say, right? And one child really, sees the home with sentimental value, right? And the other child really just needs the money for other things, let's say, right?
Sure.
And you can create potentially a lot of conflict if you don't plan ahead for that.
Sure.
And this is where, like, what I value most as you do this kind of advanced planning is kind of the collaborative conversation. Like, are you surfacing what those desires are? Like, you might have the desire to pass it down, but actually, do your children intend to keep it? And if
Mm.
they do, how do we make sure that we can plan ahead for what that tax burden is? What can we sock away now that makes that, like a much smoother process?
Mm. It's just like anything in life. I think when you have a hard decision ahead, it's easy to set it aside until it's a huge problem. And
Yeah.
this seems like one of them that
Yeah, yeah. So
have
I
the
think if there's
uncomfortable,
anything, sorry, Oliver, say that again.
just to have the uncomfortable conversations sooner rather than letting things sort of build up.
I would say that, it is surprising how few people embrace those conversations until it's almost too late, right?
Right.
How often people only do a power of attorney when their healthcare provider tells them to do it before they head into a surgical procedure, for example, right? So if there's advice I have, it would be, think ahead because, actually your family will thank you. If you're clear
Mm.
about your intentions and you communicate them and you're transparent about what they are and you kind of have those value-based conversations and hopefully they're a two-way conversation, then, for me, I would want to know what my parents find important so that I can honor their wishes.
I really like the way you put that. And it's inspiring in the sense that sometimes we need a little nudge to have those conversations, and yet life shows us time and again how not not setting things aside, things that are so critical, not setting them aside is really the smart way to go. And so it's something that I think all of us in this position should keep in mind.
Yeah.
So just referring to my notes here, this is a sure. I'm turning 50 this summer, so here's all the you need.
You're very young, 50.
I think it's the hoodie. You know, anytime you put on a hoodie, you look a few years younger. All right. From what I gather, you sort of have two hats. You're the co-founder and chief strategist of GoodWorks Collective, and you're also a managing partner at Open Concept Financial Group. Could
Yes.
you sort of distinguish between the two roles, let's call them, that
Yeah. I mean, I am the kind of person where I like the kind of work where no single day looks the same. So I
Mm.
like a lot of variety. Also, I love growth. I kind of really like, the kind of work that comes together when you're experimenting and figuring out growth. Open concept actually started within Good Work, so it was kind of incubated out of that. And then I stepped into taking on a much more of an execution role there. So that's kind of how it came about. But it started from like, what's the vision for growth and how can that be made possible in the marketplace?
Mhm.
And that's the kind of work we do at Good Works Collective. It's kind of like, a combination of small businesses and ventures, right? And I just love the energy of working with smaller businesses. There's just something very infectious about that. It becomes a person's like, how do I say this? It's their life's work.
Mm.
And I find that very honorable. And then we're always thinking about, well, how do we maximize that? And how do we synchronize that with like an individual's inner calling and purpose and like, create that kind of alignment, right? Because I think it also has to do with, this appreciation of each person and what they bring to the table and how do you create kind of that collaboration. Like going back to thinking about how you design a team, I think that
Mhm.
even in small businesses, to really make it fly, a lot of times you're thinking about like, what are the elements that this one individual, like it doesn't come naturally to this individual. Therefore, how do you complement that?
There's much to be said there. Putting together an effective team when perhaps you're in an enterprise that's growing rapidly and people have multiple roles. You're adding new personnel as well as
Yes.
this is going. And the pace of change these days, I might sound like an old guy saying this, but the pace of change seems to be exponentially higher as well in certain respects. So to make sure that the team is running like a well-oiled machine, I think is sort of a task on its own.
Yeah. Have you heard of this term about like working in the business versus working on the business?
I have, yeah.
Right. And so a lot of times I think the work that we try to do is how do we shift the perspective so we start to work on the business? Right? Like, how do we
Mhm.
create those sustainable models of growth? Right? Like, how do we make sure things can be done on repeat versus, having the single person kind of play all hats, right?
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot of that. I agree with you. I think that we're just on the cusp of an even faster pace of change, right? Like the nature of real work is changing,
It's
right?
incredible.
Yeah, it's changing more than we can even perhaps fathom yet. And so I actually think, a lot of leaders, what they're really the task at hand today is actually how do you help, depending on where you're at as a where you play in the industry, et cetera, but like how do you
Mhm.
actually help people adapt to more rapid rates of change and growth? Yeah.
I'm going to bring up the topic that's, I think, unavoidable in any sort of platform these days, and that's AI. Have you delved into that whole world at work in any to any degree? I'm going to guess the answer is yes. And I'll sprinkle this in, and that is this is all I watch in the evenings when I wind down. I don't watch shows. We haven't had cable for years. All I watch is success stories. So startups that are successful,
Yeah.
because that's kind of inspiring, right? And also
Right.
the role that AI is going to play in coming years. So something I saw very recently was, and very convincing as well, was hey, depending on your role and what you do, don't necessarily have a fear of AI, but understand how it's going to impact your work. And so I kind of think back to when the internet and the web was the new thing. And I think there was some overlap there between a fear of, hey, am I going to lose my job? Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and think, well, for the most part, I don't think the introduction of the web was complementary to what people were doing already. And so I fast forward to now, and I think with the advent of AI, it's easy to be perhaps fearful, but what we should be perhaps doing is thinking forward to, hey, how can I use this to my benefit, and how can I understand how my role might be changing in the coming um,
Yeah, I think those are really astute questions. And I think that, you know, it's interesting. So I think that, yes, there is definitely a segment of the population that hear a lot about it, don't know too much about it, maybe haven't even experimented with it. So
Right.
I would say, you know, I think I read a stat somewhere, maybe 60% of the population have played with GPT. I think something in that range, right? And so agree with you that the nature of work will like look dramatically different in probably just a handful of years. I think even like thinking about certain routine tasks that I no longer do anymore compared to
Uh-huh.
2 years ago, I think you know that would very well be true, right? What I really think about is when I think about that is a adaptability. And two, actually, you know, every wave of technology change, all it really does is sharpen the pencil on people like doubling down on what makes us uniquely human and like the
Mm.
unique value that we bring. All it
Good
does is
point.
it cuts the noise from the value proposition that we might bring forward in our roles and in our jobs. Because there's something that, AI cannot replace, which is trust, confidence, you know, making a person feel seen and heard so that they can step into a better version of themselves. Like there's a
Mm.
lot of very humanistic things that, you know, you cannot get a computer to do for you.
Right. Right. And that being able to offer authenticity in what you do, it would seem to me is going to become more and more relevant because so much of what we get exposed to will be AI derived. And so I'm thinking forward a few years that an authentic experience, whether in the workplace, whether in the client service provider relationship, all the way to travel, there's going to be a premium put on, like you say, this kind of human based authenticity. And so it's kind of it's a broad topic, but I think from all the noise I'm hearing about AI, that seems to make a lot of sense to me. You know, how are you providing authenticity in in your in your work, in your role? And this seems to me that's something that AI won't be able to, by its very nature, won't be able to duplicate.
I'll give you maybe let's use a real estate example. I think this could be fun, right? So like if we applied that same lens to the service orientation of really when you're hiring a realtor, you're really, you know, you're really hiring a service, right? It's a service of guidance, of steering. You know, you might find that, you know, AI will displace potentially how you write listings or, you know, like the administrative, you know, aspects of the role, right? But, you know, the most valuable part, Oliver, like when I think about like the service of real estate is you reaching an agreement between buyer and seller. And that still means that you have to align the hearts and minds of people,
Mm.
right? Like taking into account all of the various, you know, factors and valuation and comparables and all that kind of stuff. Like ultimately, the decision maker is a person.
Right. And to feel that kind of human touch will it's already something that's highly prized. And it's only going to become more so, I think, as time goes on.
Yeah. So I hope we come to a place where, yes, like more and more work can perhaps be delegated well
Mm.
to AI, but also the human aspects are what's going to differentiate.
Mhm. That's that's really profound. I like how you put that. And as you can see, I think like most people, I'm still trying to wrap my head around things. So to hear your perspective actually is very clarifying. We have interesting times ahead, that's for sure.
Yeah. And also, you know, what it says also is that, you know, like perhaps, you know, as AI can do more and more things, right? Like, you know, the way that we show up in the world coming across as this multifaceted, interesting human being. For example, the fact that you don't watch TV and you like love success stories and you love these kind of like fascinating conversations and it kind of like, you know, drives you. Like what makes you human becomes like, what's the most attractive reason I want to work with you?
That makes perfect sense. I think this is where we're heading. And to think about these things, it's to think about these things as they're unfolding, I think it's very necessary. And so conversations like this are really priceless.
And I mean, I also think about like our next generation also, you know, like what is the society that they're going to be stepping into?
Mm.
You know, this idea of showing up as our own authentic self comes from a place of like, you know, strong kind of self-assurance and confidence.
Mm.
right? So I always think about that like for our kids too, right? Like how do I reinforce what how they understand themselves?
Yeah, I'm thinking along the same lines. I'm thinking as well that we may not want to encourage certain roles that were traditionally highly appealing. And at the risk of being controversial, I'll put a couple of out there. But I don't have the answers. But how will accounting change? Will I be able to ask AI, "Hey, here's all my banking data. Here's every line item, and yeah, put together my tax return." Okay. Now, I don't know if that's reliable or viable. It seems to me it might be. And the other sort of example that comes to mind is legal. So, hey, can you read this document for me? And kind of, here's my company. You know what's relevant to us. Kind of parse down this 100-page document into a one-page report. And yeah, I could still see a human element to it, but it's certainly questions that I'd be asking before, dedicating 6, 7 years of my life to become, say, a lawyer. So I'd love to hear what people out there watching might think of this, perhaps in the legal profession today. But it's certainly worthwhile thinking about before going feet first into that area of study, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the question is like, how do you embrace it, right? Like, how do you, create value over and above what the, AI can do now? So,
Right.
so maybe an interesting analogy is so if you think back to maybe like, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when TiVo first came on the scene and you can like, record your shows at a certain time. I don't know if you remember, but like in my childhood, I still remember like, watching Wheel of Fortune with my grandma and it's like on at a certain time. Like that's when
Yeah,
it's
you had to be there.
everyone's watching it and like this becomes like your family life in the evening centered around shows like you knew whose shows is coming on Wednesday and
For sure.
that's like grandma time or whatever it is, right? And fast forward what technology did was create kind of anytime anywhere any place TV,
Hmm.
right? So no longer do you buy TV guides to know what the schedule
The Star
is for
Week.
the next week. And what it allowed for actually was this blossoming of in the content space. Like we completely changed the dynamic where because of the change in delivery of tech like the technology delivery mechanism for content, it created this ability to monetize very, very long what we call long tail content, like niche content that only a
Hmm.
very small interested party might be curious about. But because the delivery mechanism got so cheap, it actually created all this creative content that would have never had an audience before.
I remember a clip from maybe 10, 15 years back. It was from one of the big shot directors. It may have been Martin Scorsese. But it was at the advent of YouTube, and this stuck with me. YouTube is now at 20 years, I think. So, and the comment was to the effect of, this is Scorsese talking. I look forward to the day that someone posts a video that is in contention for, say, an Academy Award. And it, back then, I remember thinking, that's crazy. How is someone going to compete with like a video camera, going to compete with a big Hollywood studio or any studio for that matter? And yet here we are. How many people have cable today? And it, what's offered online, like you mentioned, this niche content, not only is it niche to what you're interested in, but also the production quality is just incredible. And so I think it's really neat that we don't have to rely on these big Hollywood productions for our entertainment. And we don't have to run to the TV because I remember the stress. I think for me personally growing up, it was the Dukes of Hazard, which, if I'm not mistaken, was on at 8 p.m. on Fridays. So I wanted to make sure the sofa was clear. Everyone knew in advance it's Dukes of Hazard times. I'm dating myself, but that's my big memory.
Yeah, and so think of like technology changes the dimension of all these experiences and then actually created an like unexpected growth in other areas.
Hmm.
Right. So I think that if I were to answer the question, if I was a law student going into law, how would I think about it? I would think that you got to embrace it, but then figure out like what else is shifting? What else is shifting that's changing the value proposition of what I can offer?
These are the fundamental questions that, I mean, that alone I could kind of dwell on for hours. So, to teens out there trying to choose their sort of stream, I wish you all the best because things seemed kind of complicated when I had to choose what to study. And this is a long time ago. So I think back to university, I got such a kick in the computer lab. Remember these computer labs? I sent my first kind of instant message from one computer in the lab to the computer that was like a row over, and it
Yeah,
made a beep. And I was so excited and we laughed at each other. This is like 1993. And so it's hilarious. Someone has to make a movie about this, going to university in the early to mid 90s. That I think a lot of younger people will get a kick out of it. But that was the computer lab back then. I have a few quick sort of hot takes for you, rapid fire questions. If
right.
you're ready, um, all right. What's the best news of your week so far?
Snooze. This is gonna be funny. It just happened today, actually. So I have a 3-year-old who will be entering JK, and every morning he's like dying to go to big boy school, which is his elder brother goes to a public school near here,
Okay.
and so every morning he's like, when is it my turn to go to big boy school? And so I just got an email today about they're doing an orientation for kindergarten, and you can actually bring him into the school finally. I've been trying to explain to him
Exciting,
they're
huh?
getting set up, but like it's one of these things where you feel like, oh, these are momentous events in my 3-year-old life. And I just thought, how great is it that they really cater to that?
That's you come to learn as a parent that's priceless. Even even if it's not apparent in the moment. I think that's something that sort of you get the hang of eventually. Maybe not right away though, but these are momentous occasions in a kid's life. Good for him. Um, okay, is there a quote or mantra that you live by, or are you sort of more seat of your pants?
So I'm a big reader, Oliver. So journal, I save a lot of quotes and stuff. But there's one that I've been thinking about a lot more, which is it's really a faith-based concept, which is, when you trust God, you can live with your palms facing up.
I like that.
This posture of living with your palms facing up. And I like that as an imagery because it's being open to whatever life brings your way. But I also think that palms facing up is a gesture of generosity as well. It's a gesture of sharing what I have.
How can I help? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I love it. I love it. Next, what is one thing about you that would surprise most people? Perhaps people that you already know.
Think about that. I mean, I maybe I give you something very nerdy, which is a little bit
Make it
embarrassing,
nerdy,
but still
make
fun.
it food based, anything.
So going back to like the era of like vintage computing.
Okay.
So I remember when I was in high school, I was like obsessed with speed Scrabble.
Let's Scrabble.
So do
Okay.
you remember when Yahoo was like the end all and be all of the internet? It was like the organizer of the internet. Okay, and then there were like this whole division around Yahoo Games, so you could play like all variety of games. And there was you remember that you could double click and there's like all these games. So anyways, I ranked on that game. So it was a version of Scrabble. I can't remember the name anymore. Like maybe it was not called Scrabble because it's licensed, but anyways, it was like
Uh-huh.
but there was a timer and you had to like do your move in seconds.
It sounds hard. That sounds
And I
really
was such
hard.
a
And
nerd
you
and I
were
loved it.
globally ranked. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really neat. I just had a flashback when you mentioned Yahoo. I think that was the portal for getting into chess. There was a chess option. It was interactive, which seemed like the coolest thing back then. And I remember having probably a terrible ranking because I'm not that great at chess and getting like beaten within seconds. So that's my memory of Yahoo Yahoo Games. Here's one for you. You mentioned that you love reading. Is there a book or author that sort of is top of mind that you could recommend?
Okay, there is one. I have recommended this to quite a few people. So, and this might be your jam. I am a lover of exploring this idea of like a person's inner calling and purpose. so that they
Mhm.
can continue to find alignment around that. And I think it's an evolving thing. So nobody ever says, I found my purpose. It's just kind of you continue to excavate and discover and, kind of new, I guess, insights might emerge. But there's this wonderful book called Let Your Life Speak by the author is Parker Palmer. And in it, he asks the question, like, what is the story like that you want to tell with your life?
Mm.
And it's just like pushes you to think beyond perhaps like the autopilot of, how we carry ourselves to really think about like, what is it? Like, what would you want to say if you let your life speak?
Mm. That's that's deep. I right away I think of how it's so easy to be caught up in the day-to-day commitments that you lose sight of who you are and what you're striving for. And so, yeah, I think that book would really speak to me as well.
Yeah, check it out. Check it out. He's written quite a number of books, but also like just he's a very humanistic storyteller too.
The last one on my list is what's a goal or dream that you've been chasing for a long time?
Yeah, there's a vision I have. It's on my bucket list. I don't even know if it's a
Mhm.
named destination, but I have this vision of some in the next couple of years, maybe in the next 5 years, I'd like to make this possible, which is like, over the summer, I want to almost like bring our family and go somewhere completely foreign and different and live a different life for, I want to say at least 6 to 8 weeks. Like it's got to be like an immersive experience,
I
almost
was just
like
going to say
go to the
immersive.
jungle or something and like just like live there like the locals.
That circles back in some way to the sense of authenticity that is going to become, I think, more and more prized. So, are you going to go just to the spot that's already been on your Instagram feed times a million? Or are you going to venture someplace that's sort of new and that's kind of becoming increasingly difficult to accomplish? So, do you have any destinations on your kind of radar?
I don't know yet. I think that I'd like it to be very like nature oriented, although I've never done like hardcore camping. So I feel like it's going to be totally outside of my comfort zone. So we might explore. I don't know yet. But I
Yeah,
like the idea of going through like a kind of like an interesting learning and adaptation experience as a family. Because I kind of feel like that's a life
priceless.
skill.
Priceless. Learning
Yeah.
together and being exposed to something new together. These are something I read recently that struck home is that some huge percentage of kids' memories or memories from childhood are based on family travel. I think the percentage was 80 or 90%.
Yeah, yeah,
Whatever the
yeah.
case may be, if you think back to your own memories from childhood, so many of them are based on family trips. Is that the case for you as well? It is for me.
Yeah, I mean, they tend to be highlights, don't they? Right? Like they
Mm.
tend to be markers in our mind around different phases and stages of life.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
it's perhaps the other component to that is that this was a time when you had quality time with your family and not just sort of stuck in the day-to-day routine where you have commitments. So I think that that might play a role as well.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you said that because it makes me think about like sometimes even when you're together, like, you're kind of on your screen or they're on their screen. Like this is part of
Right.
like that whole experience of like perhaps like stepping away from those screens.
Yeah. I'm going to throw out unsolicited. I'm going to throw out three options for you.
Yes.
I may be entirely off base. Okay. Number one is Japan, but not the usual three destinations, which are Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka. I saw somewhere on my feed. I have a lot of Japan on my feed. That's where I met my wife. And somehow the algorithm knows this. So I have a lot of Japan on my feed, and there was a Japanese person saying, "Hey, there's a lot more to this country than just those three spots. Come and explore." And it was this incredible visuals came on of this region of Japan. So I'll put that out there.
Yeah, I
I'm going to
love.
put out this is probably way over the top, but my wife is Colombian, and in the south of Colombia, Colombia has a bit of everything, but in the south of Colombia is the Amazon. I mean, that's pretty advanced. I don't know if your
That
kids
is
are old
pretty,
enough yet,
yes.
but it certainly would be memorable. And the last one that pops into my head is The Rockies, and there's so much to explore, and the parks there. And I say this because my exposure to the West Coast was so limited until we took a family trip last year and went on. We got on the train from Vancouver to Jasper and did some exploring around there, and it felt like being in a different country. And it there was a newfound appreciation for what we have, how blessed we are to have what we do right here at home in Canada. And it's such a vast country, and we always hear this, but until you experience it, it's hard to really comprehend. So that was a really cool family trip that we took last year. So
Yeah.
I'm
Did you
not
do
saying
like a winter trip or a summer trip?
this was, oh, we got so lucky. We went mid March, I think over March break. When we landed in Vancouver, it was, and this is unusual, it was sunny for all 3, 4 days we were there and right around 15 degrees. So while we're still stuck in snowbanks in Toronto, there were flowers blooming in the parks there. This was maybe March 15th to 20th.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And hopped on the train and then got to, which is a whole experience in itself. It's something that I'll never forget. My kids will never forget. And then did some exploring around Jasper. So that was the time of year. I think it seems to me that any time of year you go, there'd be something absolutely compelling to experience there. But that's my top three list for you.
I
Totally
will look into
unsolicited.
send me the Japanese recommendation too. I'm gonna look into that.
Sure.
I love like learning about the rainforest, so that might be a good option too.
All
And
right. Sounds like
I
I,
feel like you're right. I have not traveled Canada as much as I would like to. Um, yeah, so I think this year might be another opportunity to do that too.
Winnie, this was incredible. I've gotten to know you a lot more. And I just love how sort of holistic your answers are and your kind of way of thinking. And it's absolutely thought provoking as well. So for that, I thank you and for your time today. Thank you so much for taking this time and joining me.
For sure. And the time just flew by. And it was so lovely to get to know you better as well, Oliver. So this was real pleasure. Thank you.